My name is Daniel Reyes, and 8 months ago I made the best purchase of my life, a quiet lake house on 3 acres, with my own private dock. What I didn't know was that this quiet purchase would drag me into a war with a homeowners association that thought they owned water they never actually had a claim to. If you're new here, welcome. If you've watched my other stories, you know how this goes. Someone with a little power decides the rules apply to everyone except themselves. Stick around, because this one has a twist that even I didn't see coming until I dug through 60-year-old land records. Let me take you back to the beginning. I've been renting in the city for 12 years, saving every spare dollar, dreaming about a place with actual quiet, no sirens, no upstairs neighbors dragging furniture at 2 a.m., just water and trees. When my realtor sent me the listing for the lake property in Cedar Hollow Estates, I drove out the same afternoon. The moment I saw the dock stretching into that glassy water, I knew. The sale went through in March. The deed listed the parcel boundaries clearly. My property extended to the center line of the lake, granting me what the title called riparian and literal water rights, legal language for the right to use and access the water bordering my land. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to fish on weekends. I moved in the first week of April. My neighbors seemed pleasant enough at first, polite waves, a few "welcome to the neighborhood" comments. It was the 3rd week when I got my first knock from someone named Diane Whitfield, who introduced herself as the HOA board president for Cedar Hollow Estates. She handed me a laminated packet. "Just so you're aware of our community guidelines," she said, smiling in that particular way people smile when they're not actually being friendly. I skimmed it: noise rules, paint colors, trash bin placement. Standard stuff. I thanked her and figured that was that. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I took my boat out for the first real fish of the season. I caught a decent bass, took a photo, and posted it on the neighborhood Facebook group because a couple people had asked how the fishing was. Big mistake. The next morning, there was a bright yellow notice taped to my front door: violation notice, unauthorized use of association waters. Fine, $150. Repeat violations subject to increased penalties and possible restriction of dock privileges. I stood there rereading it 3 times. Association waters. I owned the water rights to that section of the lake. It was written directly into my deed. I called the HOA office immediately. "Mrs. Whitfield, I think there's been a mistake," I said when she picked up. "My deed grants me water rights to the lake frontage on my property. I'm not violating anything by fishing off my own dock." Her tone shifted instantly, clipped and rehearsed. "The association manages all recreational use of the lake for safety and consistency, Mr. Reyes. All residents, regardless of deed language, must follow HOA fishing permits and posted hours. There's no permit mentioned anywhere in my closing documents," I said. "That's not something I can discuss over the phone. You can bring your concerns to the next board meeting." Click. I sat there stunned. I wasn't trying to start a fight. I just wanted to fish on my own property. But something about her tone, that flat, practiced dismissal, told me this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern, and I was about to become part of it. I paid the $150 fine that week, mostly because I didn't want late fees stacking up while I figured out what was actually going on. That turned out to be exactly the wrong move, because it only encouraged them. I went to the next HOA meeting, held in the clubhouse behind the community pool. About 15 residents were scattered in the folding chairs, and the 5 board members sat behind a long table like a tribunal. When my turn came to speak, I calmly explained that my deed included explicit water rights and asked for the specific bylaw that overrode a legally recorded property right. Diane didn't answer directly. Instead, the board's attorney, a man named Gary Holt, who I later learned was Diane's brother-in-law, stood up and said the association had historically managed the lake since the 1990s and that all residents, new and old, are expected to comply with existing community standards regardless of individual deed language. That sentence should have been a red flag to everyone in that room. An HOA cannot simply override a legally recorded property right through a historical practice. But nobody questioned it. A few people actually nodded along, as if repetition made it true. I didn't argue further that night. I'd learned enough from watching how these things go. You don't win an HOA fight by yelling in a meeting. You win it with paper. So I went home and started pulling every document I could find. I started with my own closing documents, then requested the full title history from the county recorder's office. Most people don't realize this, but property deeds are public record, and title companies keep chain of title reports going back decades. I paid the small fee and had the full history within a week. What I found didn't just support my case, it blew the entire HOA's authority out of the water, pun fully intended. Cedar Hollow Estates wasn't the original developer of the land around the lake. Back in 1961, the lake and surrounding parcels were part of a private land grant to a family named the Aldridges, long before any HOA existed. When the Aldridge family eventually sold off the land in phases during the 1980s, each deed for lakefront parcels, including mine, carried the original 1961 water rights forward. The developer who later built Cedar Hollow Estates in the 1990s never actually owned the lake itself. They built around it and simply assumed management of it, likely because nobody in the neighborhood ever checked. In other words, for over 30 years, the HOA had been managing and issuing fishing permits for water they never legally controlled. I sat back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a long moment. This wasn't a small technicality. This was potentially decades of an HOA collecting fines and issuing permits under an authority that legally didn't exist for lakefront water use. But I knew better than to walk into the next meeting waving a piece of paper and declaring victory. HOAs don't back down just because they're wrong. I needed this locked down by a real estate attorney before I said another word to Diane Whitfield. I hired Patricia Nguyen, a property rights attorney 2 towns over who specialized in exactly this kind of dispute, HOA overreach on riparian rights. She reviewed the chain of title, the 1961 land grant documents, and my deed for almost 2 weeks before calling me back. Daniel, she said, this isn't just a strong case. This is about as clean a water rights claim as I've seen. The HOA has no legal standing to fine you for using water attached to your own deeded riparian rights. And depending on how many fines they've issued to other lakefront owners over the years, this could be a lot bigger than just your case. That last part stuck with me. How many other homeowners had just quietly paid their fines like I almost did, assuming the HOA had the authority it claimed? I started asking around discreetly. A retired couple 2 docks down told me they'd been fined for unauthorized watercraft 3 separate times over the years. Another neighbor said he'd simply stopped fishing altogether rather than deal with the hassle. Patricia drafted a formal legal letter to the HOA board, citing the 1961 land grant, the unbroken chain of title, and formally demanding the immediate cessation of any fines, permits, or restrictions related to lakefront water use on parcels holding original riparian rights. She also requested a full accounting of every water-related fine issued in the community's history. I expected some kind of panic. What I got instead was Diane Whitfield doubling down harder than ever. 3 days after Patricia's letter arrived, a new notice went up on the community bulletin board, not directed at me by name, but clearly aimed at me. Reminder: all lakefront residents must possess a current HOA recreational water permit. Failure to comply may result in dock access restriction and increased violation fees, effective immediately. Then my dock gate, the shared access gate the HOA had installed years earlier along the community path, was suddenly padlocked with a new combination that hadn't been shared with me. I called Patricia immediately, furious. She stayed calm, which in hindsight was exactly what the situation needed. "This actually helps us," she said. "They're escalating right after receiving a formal legal notice referencing their lack of authority. That's not just overreach anymore. Depending on your dock's legal access easement, this could be interference with a recorded property right, maybe even trespass on their part." She was right. My deed included a specific ingress-egress easement guaranteeing dock access regardless of any HOA-controlled gate. Locking me out wasn't just petty, it was actionable. Patricia filed for an emergency temporary restraining order that same week, requiring the HOA to restore access to my dock immediately while the broader case proceeded. The judge granted it within 48 hours, the deed language was simply too clear to argue against. When the sheriff's deputy showed up at the HOA office to deliver the court order, I heard secondhand that Diane went pale reading it. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt something shift. This wasn't just my word against theirs anymore. This was a judge, reading the same documents I had, agreeing that something was very wrong here. But I knew the real fight, the full lawsuit over decades of wrongful fines, was still ahead of us. The full case took nearly 4 months to reach a hearing. In that time, Patricia's discovery request forced the HOA to hand over every water-related fine and permit record going back to when Cedar Hollow Estates was founded. What came back was staggering, over $340,000 in fines collected from lakefront residents over 3 decades, all under an authority the HOA never actually held. Word had spread through the neighborhood by then. 2 other lakefront families joined the case once they realized their own deeds carried the same 1961 riparian language. What started as my personal dispute over a $150 fishing fine had turned into a class action against the entire HOA board. At the hearing, Gary Holt, the same attorney who'd smugly dismissed my deed language months earlier, tried to argue that the HOA's decades of consistent management created some form of implied authority. The judge wasn't having it. "Mr. Holt," the judge said, "you're asking me to accept that an association can override a recorded 1961 water rights grant simply because they've been doing it long enough. That is not how property law works. A right doesn't expire because someone else assumed control of it without authority." The ruling came down 2 weeks later. The court ordered the HOA to immediately cease all fines, fees, and permit requirements related to lakefront water access for any parcel carrying the original riparian rights language. It also ordered restitution. Every fine collected under the invalid authority, going back as far as records existed, had to be refunded with interest. For the 3 lakefront families involved in the case, that meant real money coming back. My own refund alone came to just over $11,000 once interest was calculated, spanning fines collected before I'd even bought the house, paid by the previous owner and factored into my settlement. The fallout inside the HOA was almost as satisfying as the ruling itself. At the next annual meeting, the first one after the ruling became public record, Diane Whitfield didn't even show up. 2 other board members resigned within the month, citing personal reasons, though everyone in the neighborhood understood exactly what that meant. A new board was elected within 6 weeks, made up mostly of residents who'd been quietly frustrated with the old leadership for years but never had a reason strong enough to challenge it. One of the first things the new board did was formally rewrite the community bylaws to explicitly recognize existing riparian rights and remove every reference to association-managed water permits. I still see Diane occasionally, walking her dog along the community path. We don't speak. I don't need her to apologize, and honestly, I don't think she ever would. Some people never really believe they did anything wrong, they just believe they got unlucky enough to be caught. What matters more to me is what happened afterward. The 2 other families who joined the case have become close friends. We fish together most weekends now, off my dock, completely permit-free, exactly the way it should have been from the very beginning. Looking back, the thing that strikes me most isn't the money, or even the ruling itself. It's how close I came to just quietly paying that first fine and never questioning it again. If I hadn't posted that one fish photo, if Diane hadn't overreached by locking that gate, I might still be paying recreational water permits for a right I already legally owned. So if there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: never assume an HOA's authority is automatically valid just because they act like it is. Read your deed. Pull your title history. Sometimes the paperwork sitting in a dusty county archive is worth more than every laminated rulebook they hand you at the door. That's my story. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that acted like the rules only applied to everyone else, I want to hear about it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to subscribe. We post new HOA stories every week, and trust me, some of the ones coming up are even wilder than this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.